Thank you, Jera. Good morning. Welcome to the First Unitarian Church of Cincinnati. My name is Tim Kraus. Located on the ancestral lands of the Adena, Hopewell, Miamia, and Shawnee people, our urban community welcomes all with love. We support learning and spiritual growth, we serve the wider community, and we work for justice, equality, and inclusion. We're glad you're here with us today, whether in person or virtually. During the service, you may hear mention of programs or other items of interest. It may raise questions for you. If you would like to learn more about these events, our community, or ask about our community and faith, please contact us at member-care@firstuu.com. That's member-care@firstuu.com. We begin our time today by lighting our chalice, the chosen symbol of our faith, with these words by Matthew Taylor. And it's called The Change. I can feel the change coming like growing pains. I feel the change in my bones, pulling me, stretching me, forming me into the true I am. Can you feel it? The change in our bodies as we adapt, we grow, we change. The weight shifting and molding to fit this evolving body that we are in. Guided by faith that this too will pass. We can survive this because our ancestors survived. Can you feel them in your DNA? You, a mixture of their particles that was molded to fit your spirit. Change and shift, mold and grow. Yet in some ways, we stay the same.
A flock of birds, a Jataka tale. A great flock of quail lived together in the forest. Food was plentiful and life was peaceful. One day, a crafty hunter, who could imitate their song perfectly, came to the forest. When he whistled, a great group of quail gathered in response. When the flock landed on the ground, the hunter approached silently and threw a huge net over them. With a hearty laugh, he slung the net over his shoulder and took the quail to market. Each day he played this trick, and the flock grew smaller and smaller. After some time, the wisest old quail assembled what was left of the flock and said, "The hunter is skilled and can easily trick you into his net. If you work together, he cannot defeat you. Beat your wings as one, and you will lift the net that binds you." The flock listened carefully to the old quail's words. The next time the hunter came and threw his net over a group of quail, they were not dismayed. As one, they beat their wings. They rose, taking the net with them. They swooped down onto a tree. As the net caught and snagged in the tree's branches, the birds flew out from underneath it to freedom. The hunter looked up in amazement and thought, "When the birds cooperate, I cannot capture them. Each bird is small, and yet together they can lift the net." The next day, the hunter again flung his net over a large group of quail as they pecked seeds on the ground. Pleased with their mighty accomplishment of the day before, the quail began to beat their wings together. Accidentally, one quail bumped into another and started a ruckus. "Watch out!" squawked the bird. "You are stepping on my tail feathers." "Someone pushed me," retorted the other with a hard peck. "This is no time to fight," scolded another still. "The hunter is almost here. We must all work together and peacefully fly as one." "You are not the mighty ruler," sniped the first. "Stop telling us what to do." While they squabbled and scolded, postured and fought, the hunter arrived and the birds were caught. He scooped up his net and proclaimed, "I'm the winner." Together they're strong, divided their dinner. I wonder, does this story remind you of any other stories?
We come to the time in our service where we honor our joys and our sorrows. And I'm reminded that there still is a war going on in Europe, and there are wars in other countries and other regions of the world. We as a world sit in a precarious position and always teetering on the edge of the abyss, it seems, in this 21st century. But I'm also reminded of a joy that even in the midst of adversity, we have found a way to celebrate transgender people. The Transgender Day of Recognition and Visibility was just this last week. And it's a real positive way for us to strike out against all of the prejudice and all of the bias in our society that is working against people with different gender identities throughout the world. And so the Transgender Day of Visibility is extremely important for that community, and we need to celebrate it as well, because it is a victory. We have our stones and water in front of me, and the stones represent our joys and our sorrows. The water represents the love of community. By dropping stones in the water, we are softening our sorrows and amplifying our joys. All the individual joys and sorrows coming together in one bowl of the water to be shared and borne by us all collectively. Community, that's what it's all about. So at this time, I invite you to come forward up the side aisles. Pick up a stone and drop it in the water, and then return through the center. I'm going to drop a couple more stones in, and one for the people who are not here, who have experienced joys and sorrows in their lives, and one for the names of folks who we hold close to our hearts that we have not spoken of. So, as we meditate on our joys and sorrows, we will be looking at the beautiful flowers that Mary Mark provided for us today, and Jera will accompany that with some meditative music.
Good morning. I'll stand back. Today is the final day of the 2022-23 Reconnect and Recommit Stewardship Campaign. The Stewardship Committee would like to thank everyone who has pledged, and we would like to give an update of where we are currently with the campaign. Rebecca Schaefer, who has organized the conversations that the canvassers have had with all of you, reports that valuable information is being gathered and compiled, and there are emerging themes that Rebecca will report to you after a full analysis of the conversations has happened. These conversations will guide the board as we plan our path forward. We have received, give or take, about 80 pledges out of 140 pledges, so we still have some pledges to collect. We have a commitment, more or less, because it's a moving target and they're coming in by the minute. We've collected $259,300 with a total pledge goal of $389,000. So as you can see, we're a little bit short of that goal, but in the next 2 weeks, we will be following up with households that we haven't heard from yet. If we do not reach our goal, the board will have to make decisions about whether we do hire the 2 positions that we had hoped to hire, office administrator and a director of operations. To close our final plea from the pulpit, I'd like to share the full reading of The Task of a Religious Community by Mark Morrison Reed. The central task of the religious community is to unveil the bonds that bind each of us to all. There is a connectedness, a relationship discovered amid the particulars of our own lives and the lives of others. Once felt, it inspires us to act for justice. It is the church that assures us that we are not struggling for justice on our own, but as members of a larger community. The religious community is essential, for alone, our vision is too narrow to see all that must be seen, and our strength is too limited to do all that must be done. Together, our vision widens and our strength is renewed. The Stewardship Committee and the board hope that this campaign has helped you reconnect to First Church, that together our vision has widened and the strength of First Church has been renewed.
If you haven't given your pledge yet, you still may do so by going online or responding to the email that all members received. Giving to First Church is easy. You can text the word GIVE to 513-717-7373. And if you have access to our Breeze member system, you may click Give Now. Or you can give online at firstuu.com. You can also write a check to First Unitarian Church of Cincinnati and mail it to 536 Linton Street, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45219. If this is your first time with us, please let the virtual plate pass you by. Your presence is gift enough to our church. Our Share the Plate offering for this month is going to be the Carter Justice Fund. And the Carter Justice Fund proceeds will be distributed among the various different outreach efforts that we're engaged in the Avondale community. And that will be a collection that we will be gathering the entire month of April. I guess there still is a way to get back to Kansas, isn't there? In the course of our work with the Right Relations Task Force, we came to the understanding that it's important to understand our history. Because often dysfunctional conflict that emerges in a congregation is part of the organizational history and the DNA of that congregation. The interesting thing about this realization is that the opposite of that is also true. Many of the things that attract people to our congregation, and many of the things our congregation has gotten right over the years, is also in our DNA. These two opposite forces have existed side by side in a not so comfortable coexistence from day one in our congregation. In 1830, the founding date of our church marked the beginning of a truly remarkable time in our city and nation. Within 30 years, Cincinnati became the 6th largest city in the country, with an extremely diverse population that was just as cosmopolitan as any of the East Coast cities. Unitarians came to Cincinnati as transplants from New England, seeking fame and fortune. That wasn't as difficult as it sounded because our members were already pretty wealthy, and they were also fairly well known. First Church carved out an identity for itself as the center of liberal religion and thought in the city. We were on the cutting edge of many progressive ideas for the city. We led programs of social uplift and even created an associate minister at large for the city, looking after the poor and the oppressed. And we led the charge for public education in Cincinnati. We openly identified our congregation as an anti-slavery church, which was not a very popular position in an overwhelmingly pro-slavery Cincinnati. Members of our congregation had significant national and local political impact. Local, state, and national legislators, governors, ambassadors, presidential cabinet members, and even a president of the United States came out of this congregation. On the whole, there were many reasons to be proud of where we stood in the world and in the city. The context in which our church began and then thrived was a very complex one. As a nation, the United States seriously grappled with what it meant to be a democracy and what kind of a democracy were we going to be when millions of people were held in captivity in one of the cruelest forms of slavery that the world had ever witnessed. Andrew Jackson was our president during this time. His racist campaign to remove all indigenous nations from the lands east of the Mississippi River played itself out in Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama, and right here in Cincinnati. Our church ancestors would have witnessed the herding of Shawnee, Delaware, and Wyandot people onto the flatboats down on the Ohio River as they were floated away to lands in Kansas and Oklahoma. We witnessed that. By 1829, the year our church on 4th and Ray Street was under construction, Cincinnati was considered the blackest city in America. 10% of the city's population was free black, which was a larger percentage than any other city in the country. That was also the year that the largest race riot in American history, up to that point, had taken place only 2 blocks away from our church's construction site. It was that area between 4th Street and the river where most of that riot took place. Cincinnati's economy thrived on the proceeds of slavery, so the business community promptly decided to do something about it, and they promised the Irish working class that they could get better wages, better jobs, if they would just only help them thin out the black population who were competing for the same jobs with them. And so that became the pretext for the riots. When the dust finally settled in September of 1829, half of the black population was gone from this city. They either left in a pine box or they were driven out of the city to other locations. This pattern of white rampages through the black sections of Cincinnati repeated itself at least twice every 10 years, up to the Civil War, because our black population kept expanding at the same rate that the city was growing. So these quote-unquote race riots kept the black population in check and thinned out what was there. What riots could not accomplish in regulating the black community in Cincinnati, the black codes dating back to 1804 finished off. The white population of Ohio was determined to make this state as hostile to free black people as they possibly could. If you were black, you could not vote. You could not own property unless transacted by a white man, or conduct any sort of business dealings. You couldn't testify in a court of law against a white man, and at all times you had to show social deference to white people. Given that setting, it's a true testament to the courage and determination of Cincinnati's black community to survive and to protect itself. It was also the backdrop from which many white people who wanted to work for racial equality in the city had to constantly face. That would have been true for the members of our church and to all people who wanted to end slavery. This all came to a head within the 4th year of our church's existence. The Lane Theological Seminary in Walnut Hills was exactly the same age as our church and under the leadership of Lyman Beecher, who happened to be the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Led by true radicals like Henry Brewster Stanton, who later married Elizabeth Cady Stanton, James Tone, Theodore Dwight Weld, and James Bradley, the first black seminarian in America, the Lane students took it upon themselves to create the first anti-slavery society in Cincinnati in 1834. They also put their faith into practice by moving in with black families in Cincinnati, in the downtown of Cincinnati, setting up impromptu schools to educate their children, and generally living as social equals in that community. In fact, the first interracial picnic in America probably took place on the lawn of Lane Theological Seminary, just 2 blocks away from us. They faced an onslaught of hate from the white community, enduring insults, being spit upon, and physically attacked. The uproar led to their expulsion from the seminary, and they ultimately left Cincinnati to help found the first interracial coeducational college in America. That's Oberlin College up near Cleveland. What they left behind, however, was a movement of resistance to slavery that continued to grow in both the black and white communities. And that included people from our church. Our church ancestors witnessed all of this with very mixed emotions. Except for a few of our members, we were prominent liberals after all, not social change radicals. And that's one of the issues that liberalism has always had to face, that we could often shy away from a more radical perspective on things. A culture of resistance that long existed in the black community was finally taking hold in the left-leaning segment of the white community. White participation in the always black-led Underground Railroad grew, even in Cincinnati. And one can imagine the sense of tension that existed among our members. They were primarily wealthy business and professional people who wanted to be on the right side of history, but they were torn by their social status and the way they made a living, often profiting from the proceeds of slavery. So that's a difficult position to be in for all of us. In the late 1830s, our church selected William Henry Channing as our minister. He was a passionate anti-slavery preacher, and that sat well with our liberal instincts. And he had the right pedigree. Channing was the nephew of William Ellery Channing, the founder of modern Unitarianism. You couldn't get much better pedigree than that. What we didn't bargain for was that he might actually ask us to put our beliefs into practice and live out our faith. This is where the rubber met the road. He wasted no time in befriending the most liberal and left-leaning thinkers of the city. He joined the literary society that Harriet Beecher Stowe and her husband Calvin Stowe belonged to. Daniel Drake belonged to that. So did Selman P. Chase, who ultimately became a Supreme Court judge. And he also acquainted himself with the more radical students of Lane Seminary who were still around. Things quickly came to a conflict in 1841 when the Cincinnati Anti-Slavery Society approached Channing about using our church as its meeting place. Now, Channing knew that this was going to be a difficult decision for our congregation. So he brought the idea before the membership, and they decidedly voted against the motion. Rather than challenge the few leading members of the church who drove that vote because they had conflicts of interest, Channing remained silent. He also decided not to challenge the congregation on their increasingly conservative Christian theology. He ultimately stated that his reason for leaving as a crisis of his own personal faith because he knew he was very far away from the social and theological values of the leading members of our congregation. He understood that he was generally loved and revered by almost everybody in the congregation, and they all wanted him to stay. But he knew that just a few prominent people in the church could easily destroy him and his ministry, and he just didn't want to subject himself to that. So he moved on to ultimately become the chaplain of the House of Representatives and minister of the Washington, D.C. Unitarian Church during the Civil War years. Following in his footsteps as our minister was Channing's cousin. He also had the great pedigree because he was partially raised by William Ellery Channing, and his name was James Handesed Perkins. He was almost like a brother to William Henry. Not being seminary trained, Perkins reluctantly accepted our congregation's call because he, like Channing, was loved by everybody. That love affair did not last long, however, because, again, the same prominent members that Channing feared soon grew to think that Perkins was not quite up to the prestige in the pulpit that our congregation demanded. And as the leading liberal institution in the city. Furthermore, Perkins had some problems with a little bit of the exclusive nature of the Unitarian community. He wanted to broaden the appeal, and he wanted to limit the exclusive nature of Unitarianism by including people of other theological persuasions. So, lost my place here. In 1848, a petition signed by just a few of the members circulated to the church trustees, demanding that they remove Perkins from the pulpit because he was too melancholy and not up to maintaining the proper image of the church in the city. This is exactly what Channing feared would have happened to him. Perkins responded by offering his resignation after a resounding majority of the congregation begged him to stay. In his resignation letter, he wrote, "However united your voices may have been last Sunday evening, there is a portion of this society which can speak loud enough to bring an echo from beyond the mountains." He was clearly indicating that a few people in the church were basically calling the shots. He concluded that a divorce is far better than a divided house. In closing, he refused to rescind his resignation, but he agreed to stay on until the church found his replacement. Before we could find his replacement, James H. Perkins died tragically from what many people considered to be a suicide. Yes, we can be really hard on our ministers. Abiel Abbott Livermore succeeded Perkins in the pulpit in 1850 and served our congregation until the summer of 1856. Now, I know that Reverend Connie said that our faith was a faith without a creed, and that's one of the hallmarks of Unitarianism. But Reverend Livermore actually wrote a creed for our congregation. And it reflected, again, a deeper move into more Orthodox Christianity for our church. And the creed stated that believing in one God, our Heavenly Father, in one Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, in the revelation contained in the Holy Scriptures, and in the immortality of the human soul, and desiring to unite together for the object of promoting the Christian faith. 209 members signed that creed when it was written in 1855. All new members were asked, but they weren't required to affirm this statement, which actually flew in the face of what Unitarianism was all about nationwide. We seem to be conforming to a more orthodox version of Christianity. And in many ways, this ran counter to contemporary Unitarian theology that had also started to grapple with the implication of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, because The Origin of the Species was published in 1848 and people were starting to read it. And then there was also the new school of historical biblical criticism that applied the scientific method to the study of the Bible, which was raising questions about theology and understanding of what the historical Christ was all about. Meanwhile, our nation's descent into the abyss of civil war continued in an accelerated form with the passage of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. Increased public resistance to slavery followed, and the Underground Railroad seemed to have a trunk line that ran right through the middle of Cincinnati. The abolitionist and pro-slavery forces lined up against each other in Cincinnati, with the pro-slavery sentiment reflecting the vast majority of our population. We definitely were a northern town with a southern exposure. Much of this came to a heated crescendo during Livermore's last year with her congregation. In January of 1856, Margaret Garner escaped her sexual enslavement to Archibald Gaines in Covington, Kentucky. When the bounty hunters found her, she decided that death was preferable to returning to slavery. So she proceeded to kill her 2-year-old daughter and then attempted to kill herself and her other 3 children. The 2-week trial that followed had several things to decide, and the rest of the world was looking at Cincinnati. Was Margaret Garner a person or property? Did she kill a person or did she destroy property? Did Ohio have legal standing to actually put her on trial? On the last day of the trial, Unitarian and frequent First Church attendee Lucy Stone, and Lucy Stone was a militant feminist, an abolitionist, and widely renowned as one of the founders of the modern women's movement. She served as a witness for Garner, stating that Garner was sexually enslaved to Mr. Garner and that her children were also his children. Stone continued that to return Garner and her children to Gaines was a defiling act against humanity. Lucy Stone was on the stand also because she was accused of trying to slip a knife to Garner so that she could kill herself rather than to be returned to slavery and the hell of that enslavement. The trial was actually a charade, as the court ruled on all counts that Margaret Garner, first of all, was not a person, because the Constitution defined her as only 3/5 of a person. And finally, that the Fugitive Slave Act superseded any Ohio law that would actually give her a possibility of freedom. The judge mandated Garner's return to the man who claimed to own her. Needless to say, Lucy Stone's involvement in this trial stirred heartburn among the more conservative liberal members of our congregation. They were worried about our church's reputation in the community, and they felt that they needed to uphold it. The scene was set for Livermore's exit with the deepest division our church was to ever experience waiting in the wings with the arrival of Moncure Conway. Now, Moncure Conway was an abolitionist son of Virginia aristocracy. His family had been a long slaveholding family, and he even had a great-grandfather who signed the Declaration of Independence. He was a cousin to Robert E. Lee, and he also had a great-uncle who was currently serving on the Supreme Court. Conway, however, never adjusted to slavery, and he grew to resent how it was destroying the fabric of Southern society. He found his way to Unitarianism through Ralph Waldo Emerson and William Henry Furness. And Furness was the minister of the church that Reverend Connie came from, First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia. At Furness and Emerson's urging, he attended Harvard Divinity School, which brought him closer to Emerson and also to Theodore Parker, who opened the door to what it meant to be an abolitionist and a radical Unitarian. He developed a son and father relationship with Emerson that would last the rest of Emerson's life. Conway secured his first ministerial assignment with the Washington, D.C. Unitarian Church at the early age of 22. He was definitely a prodigy. He entered college at age 14, got his bachelor's degrees at 17, and had a divinity degree before he was 21. He was destined to a short tenure in the pulpit in Washington, however, because that congregation had agreed that a discussion of slavery would be forbidden in order to preserve the internal peace of their church. This church had been founded by John C. Calhoun and John Quincy Adams. John C. Calhoun being the senator from South Carolina who was very pro-slavery, and John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, who was a Unitarian and a staunch anti-slavery advocate. The two of them were friends, and they founded the church together, and they made an agreement that slavery would not be discussed. Such were the compromises that liberals had to make in order to get along in the world. Conway could only hold his tongue so long before he ventured into those forbidden waters in his sermons. He was summarily dismissed. And let me see here. He was summarily dismissed in the summer of 1856, and word got to Cincinnati that he was available. So the church, our church, authorized Alfonso Taft to offer Conway our pulpit, full knowing that we were inviting a strong abolitionist intellectual to our congregation. We were definitely aspiring to be more than what we had been. Conway did not disappoint. His sermons were widely popular, and at the age of 24, the breadth and depth of his biblical knowledge and oratorical skills astounded many, attracting large audiences. Our church was growing in membership, probably to about the size of 250 to 300. Our church, Peter Clark, who had just returned to Cincinnati after working and living with Frederick Douglass for 2 years, started attending, realizing he had found a kindred spirit in Conway and a religious home in our church. Clark brought other similarly minded black intellectuals and activists into our sanctuary. Oddly enough, Conway rarely spoke of slavery from the pulpit. His reputation preceded him, making it not as necessary for him to sermonize on slavery like William Henry Channing did on that subject. This freed Conway to address many other theological issues and social issues of the day, like equality for women, the rights of labor to earn a fair wage, and a newer theological study that challenged the literal interpretations of the Bible. Conway also threw open the doors of the church to proclaim that all were welcome, even atheists, cabaret dancers, and theater performers. He did pulpit exchange with Rabbi Wise, giving the rabbi and Judaism credibility that no other church had ever given Jews. He held public dances in the basement, which was a social outrage. He campaigned for the legalization and the protection of prostitution by saying that until we can pay women a fair and equal wage for their work, we have no ground to condemn them for making a living as a prostitute. You can imagine how well that would go over with respectable society. We were definitely a liberal church, but all of this created more than heartburn among the frozen chosen pillars of our congregation. The first hint of future trouble started early in Conway's tenure. In the spring of 1857, Conway invited his mentor and spiritual father, Ralph Waldo Emerson, for a 4-night speaking event at the church that included sharing the pulpit on Sunday morning. Emerson spoke to capacity crowds each night and bringing much attention to our church. On Sunday morning, Emerson also spoke with the children of the church, telling them stories about his dear friend, Henry David Thoreau. After Emerson went back to Massachusetts, Conway faced criticism from a few prominent members. They warned him that he was to never do such a thing again as to let Ralph Waldo Emerson defile the pulpit of our church or to corrupt the minds of our youth. He was starting to rub on them. All was forgiven because of the huge crowds that brought revenue and notoriety to the church, which was interesting. But the warning was real. The large majority of the congregation was basking in the amazement of what their new popular minister could do, while the old line members of the congregation simmered in their disapproval. Conway had clearly staked out a position in the left wing of the Unitarian movement alongside Emerson and Theodore Parker. Parker being the Unitarian that Martin Luther King Jr. frequently quoted when he stated that the moral arc of the universe was long, but it bent toward justice. Parker was considered just beyond the fringe of mainstream Unitarianism, but he definitely was Conway's hero. Throughout 1858 and 59, Conway grew bolder in the pulpit. He stopped using the Livermore Creed for any new members to sign, and he frequently wrote sermons questioning the divinity of Jesus and the nature of miracles in the New Testament while still upholding the teachings of Jesus. Finally, in February of 1859, things came to a head when John Kebler, a noted Cincinnati attorney, and he was the representative, he was the one who helped to create Antioch College, and he also was Horace Mann's personal lawyer. Robert Hosea, the mayor of Clifton, was also a prominent grocer and head of the business and commercial community in Cincinnati. They summoned Conway to Kebler's law office. Over cigars, they issued a demand for him to stop delivering sermons that repudiated the Bible and denied the resurrection, or they would launch a campaign to destroy his ministry and remove him from the church. This was two people, not an elected position, in the congregation telling the minister that they were going to launch a campaign against him if he didn't do what they said. Conway let them finish and then told them that he had to speak his conscience. He continued that he had freedom of the pulpit, and that was granted to him by the Board of Trustees, not by Kebler and Hosea. That afternoon, Kebler and Hosea drafted a petition demanding the dismissal of Conway. The petition, and I have a copy of it here, you can take a look at it afterwards, was signed by 13 people out of 250. The board rejected the petition and affirmed their support for Conway's ministry. Thus began a behind-the-scenes effort to dislodge Conway as pastor of our church. By April of 1859, this was only 2 months later, Kebler and Hosea got busy organizing, and they managed to gain the support of about a third of the congregation. The divide was deep, with Kebler, Hosea, and a number of other prominent citizens lined up against Conway's supporters, who included Alphonso Taft, future Governor George Hoadley, Judge J.B. Stallo, and a host of other left-leaning members of the congregation. Kebler, Hosea, and company refused to accept the authority of the board to make decisions, and they demanded that the church's assets be divided equally between the dissenters and the rest of the body, even though they were distinctly in the minority. As an attempt to make peace, Conway's supporters gave in and agreed to divide the church. But before the deal could be legally signed, an outraged member of the congregation filed a lawsuit to stop the division of the assets, claiming that the dissenters had no rights to any assets of this church. A protracted legal battle ensued that took 4 years to settle before the Ohio Supreme Court was forced to play Solomon and split the baby. The rest of the Unitarian world looked on in horror as they witnessed the whole sordid affair from around the country. Former First Church pastor A.A. Livermore, then the editor of the Christian Inquirer, characterized the conflict as the carnage in Cincinnati. In the short run, Conway and his supporters agreed to let Kebler, Hosea, and company have access to the church premises for Sunday evening services. It was a tension-filled spring and summer of 1859 that the two competing memberships shared space in the same building. Can you imagine? People at war with each other having to share the same space for religious services. That went on until the Church of the Redeemer found an abandoned Universalist church that they could rent and ultimately buy. One of the supporters of the Church of the Redeemer was a man by the name of Greenwood, and he owned the Eagle Iron Works, which was one of the largest employers in Cincinnati. He had about 500 employees, so he put up the money to actually get the purchase of the Universalist church going for the Church of the Redeemer. Another indication of the kind of financial resources that the Church of the Redeemer people had. The First Congregational Church continued under Conway's leadership for 3 more years, growing in membership again, regaining most of the numbers they had lost. Without the conservative wing of the church holding him back, Conway continued to move his congregation in a leftward trend. In addition to his sermons, newspaper culture columns, and social uplift campaigns, Conway wrote extensively on religion, philosophy, and politics. He's credited as one of the 3 philosophers to introduce Hegelian philosophy to America. Conway also authored a book called The Rejected Stone during this time. In that, he laid out his critique of the founding of our country. He lamented that the Constitution was deeply flawed because it rejected the sacred belief that all people are created equal. The book was reprinted widely and then ultimately issued in the backpack of every Union soldier who entered the Civil War in the first 2 years. They were all reading Moncure Conway between battles. In the summer of 1862, with the Civil War in full swing, Conway got word that the people his family had enslaved in Virginia emancipated themselves, and they were working their way north to freedom. He dropped everything, and he went east to go find and assist them in whatever way he could. In a legendary drama with lots of twists and turns, Conway arrived back in Cincinnati in the late summer of 1862 with 30 of the people his family had enslaved. Alphonso Taft provided safe passage for all of them on his Little Miami Railroad, which is the bike trail today, which connected Cincinnati to Yellow Springs, where they settled in freedom for the rest of their lives. With the war not going well, Conway decided he was going to leave Cincinnati to join the national and international stage of fighting slavery. He ended up in England, lobbying the British government to stay out of the war, and there he stayed for most of the rest of his life, except for when he made public speaking engagement tours and came to Ohio and many other places in the country. He was leading a Universalist and a Unitarian church in London for many years. But back in Cincinnati, the First Congregational Church and the Church of the Redeemer continued in their separate paths, with First Church championing left-wing causes and the Church of the Redeemer defending the conservative causes. After 4 years of pulpit supply from the East Coast, Thomas Vickers succeeded Conway in the pulpit. He possessed Conway's passion and theology and led the congregation through many social campaigns, including the successful effort to remove the Bible from religious instruction from the public schools. Now, the Church of the Redeemer took the opposing view on that, and they campaigned to keep the Bible in the schools. Ultimately, the Supreme Court decided that one as well in favor of the position that Vickers took, and they removed the Bible and religious instruction from the schools. Because First Church no longer had a building after the sale and dissolution of all the church assets, the congregation met in public assembly halls until Vickers could raise a campaign to build up enough money to build a church across the street from City Hall. It was also right beside Isaac Wise Temple downtown, with the Catholic Church on the diagonal corner away from them. Now, as in most divorces, both parties ultimately suffered. By 1874, neither church could stand independently. They both suffered major financial losses because of the economic panic of 1873. Vickers became the director of the Cincinnati Public Library and stayed there for the rest of his career, and Amory Mayo, the minister of the Redeemer Church, retired. So the Church of the Redeemer called Charles Wente as their new minister, but he refused the call unless the Church of the Redeemer would agree to merge back with First Unitarian Church. First Church was amenable to reuniting, but unwilling to yield theologically to the much more conservative Church of the Redeemer. Well, the passions of 1859 had subdued, and even though most of all the key players in this split were still around, Kebler and Hosea were still here, the Church of the Redeemer now agreed that it was no longer important what one believed about the divinity of Jesus or the absolute inerrancy of the Bible, which causes one to wonder whether theology was the true reason for the split or whether it was just a pretext for a fake fight. A new board was elected with both churches representing equally. The reunification church service took place on November 28, 1875. with Moncure Conway in the pulpit to lead the service of a church he dearly loved. The title of his sermon was First Love Again. I was able to get a copy of that from the Cincinnati Commercial, and it's quite a read. He did not hold back in his plea to let the past die away, but he also did not hold back on his critique of a narrow Christianity that thrived on division. It was the Christianity of empire and oppression that belittled other faith traditions, and he hoped that First Church would never fall prey again to an exclusive religion that exists to belittle other traditions and pathways to the truth. In short, it was a sermon that could have gotten him tarred and feathered in 1859. But now he was older and a widely respected international intellectual. He was still the smartest person in whatever room he entered, but his sense of compassion and care for all of humanity won over everybody. So looking back over this tumultuous time for our church, our city, and our nation, we see a few patterns about how our congregation dealt with conflict. First and foremost, we sought to minimize and ignore conflicts of opinion or action whenever they arose. Instead of facing our differences squarely in an attempt to understand one another in a covenantal way, we chose the path of least resistance in the hope that it would just all blow over. We could sweep it under the rug. If that didn't work, we then allowed the loudest voices to prevail, even if they were a distinct minority. We also allowed those loudest voices to undermine our democratic structures whenever it served their needs. Most importantly, we sought refuge from uncomfortable situations. We coexisted with the oppression of others in our city and accepted the unjust social order that denied basic humanity to others, even when we knew it wasn't right. To do otherwise would have put us in an uncomfortable circumstance. It seems that this is the plight of classic liberalism, to stand against injustice until it gets just a little bit too uncomfortable. It is precisely what Martin Luther King Jr. alluded to in his letter from the Birmingham jail when he challenged his liberal allies to put their bodies where their language of justice was. In 1830, we could champion public education for all white people, but shy away from the injustice of denying education to people of color. We could publicly proclaim that slavery was evil, but yet deny a place for the anti-slavery society to hold their meetings. What scared us most about Moncure Conway was that he forced us to confront our class and racial prejudices like no other minister had. He led by word and deed, and that again made us very uncomfortable. And I would suggest that that was the real reason for the fight. At the same time we behaved dysfunctionally, we also had people emerge from among us who did take those important and courageous steps to right the wrongs of the world. And they sometimes did so at great personal risk. Alfonso Taft lost business to other lawyers because he did pro bono and low-cost legal work for the black community. He actually did most of Peter Clark's legal work for him pro bono because he knew Clark needed that. As governor of Ohio, George Hoadley ended the discriminatory black codes. This was all the way in 1883 that he did this, that had oppressed the black community for 80 years. In the process, he destroyed his own political career by doing what was right. But he was willing to take that risk. And then there was Peter Clark. With the support of many in our congregation, he used our church as a place from which to become the champion of black education in Ohio. He also used our church as a platform to be a champion for the rights of labor. In so many ways, our church did emerge as a voice of conscience for the city of Cincinnati, and for that we must be grateful. And we must recognize that that is also a part of our DNA. Now, in his concluding words of that reunification sermon, Conway challenged us all to find a way to truth and honesty with each other. He asked us all to channel our own inner Christ, to seek what is best for ourselves and the world. He pleaded with us to build community. He was asking us all to put our hearts in a holy place.
When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, when we trust the wisdom in each of us, every color, every creed and kind, and we see our faces in each other's eyes. When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, when we tell our story from deep inside, and we listen with a loving mind, and we hear our voices in each other's words, then our heart is in a holy place. When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, when we share the silence of sacred space, and the God of our hearts stirs within, and we feel the power of each other's faith, then our heart is in a holy place. Then our heart is in a holy place. Then our heart is in a holy place.
Before we extinguish our chalice, I want to read some words from Bill Sinkford, our former member and former president of the UUAA. Spirit of life and love, dear God of all nations, there is so much work to do. We have only begun to imagine justice and mercy. Help us hold fast to our vision of what can be. May we see the hope in our history and find the courage and the voice to work for that constant rebirth of freedom and justice. That is our dream. Amen. So will you join with me in reciting the words that are on your screen? We will extinguish our chalice by saying these words together. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.